G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Jeremiah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So thank you. We're back now into session 11. We're looking at this session in chapter 16, verse 1 down to chapter 17, verse 27. In the last session, we see that three times Jeremiah intercedes on behalf of Judah, but each time his intercessions are rejected. First time he tries a vicarious confession on behalf of the people. We see Daniel did that once before, but that fails because the guilt of Israel is a primary reason for rejecting Jeremiah's intercession. He's actually told not to pray for this people. And this is the third time he's told not to pray for them. Second intercession, Jeremiah tries to blame the false prophets. He says, well, it's their fault. They're the ones who are giving bad advice. You know, he says to God, don't blame the people, but that's rejected also because, as we saw, the people have a choice and they choose to follow the false prophets. In the third intercession, Jeremiah brings up three reasons why God shouldn't punish Israel. He says to God, he says, listen, it's for your name's sake. You know, you're the God who is known to keep his promises. And also, you know, you can't disgrace the throne of your glory, which is a temple, because that's going to be destroyed. And he also says, remember, God, you know, you can't break your covenant with us. You can't annul your covenant. Again, rejection. God says that, he says to them, he says, listen, you know, even if the great saints like Moses and Samuel were here interceded, who have interceded in the past on behalf of Israel, he said, not going to work this time. Not going to change his mind. Judah has four possibilities coming to them. They have death, they have the sword, they have famine, which is going to be death anyway, or captivity. What we're going to see is a remnant will be exiled. In fact, what we're going to see is that the grand finale for them will be a worldwide dispersion, and Jerusalem will be destroyed. Jeremiah also, you know, he's struggling. We see Jeremiah's inner feelings here because, you know, he questions, he says, listen, why was I even born at all? You know, he says, why did I have to become this man of strife? He says, everybody is picking on me virtually. Everybody is filing complaints against me. And God's answers to him is, look, he says, look, I will strengthen you because I've called you. So stop worrying about it. Jeremiah has a second complaint. He says to God, he says, listen, don't be so long suffering that these guys will have a chance to kill me. He says, deal with them pretty quickly. And again, he says, listen, he said, I'm enduring all of this stuff, God, because of you. So please deal with these people who are picking on me all the time. Now we see that Jeremiah had a very lonely life. He's isolated from society. And he was a man, a righteous man, because he was filled with the indignation at the sins of the people. And he accuses God of having failed to sustain him as he promised. But God rebukes him and tells him to repent and stop his foolish talk, or he could actually lose his prophetic calling. God says to him, he says, listen, he says, the people are not going to prevail against you because I'm with you to save you and to deliver you so that you will be able to fulfill my calling to you. And so we now come into the message of Jeremiah's lifestyle. We see this in 16:1 to 17:27. And Jerusalem, we're going to see Jerusalem now and Judah would eventually fall to ruin. And this was the message that the prophet must proclaim by word and by deed. The second part of his message is contained in the prophet's lifestyle. Excuse me, I'm just going to switch my phones off here. Like Hosea, remember Hosea was another one of the minor prophets. Like Hosea, he prophesied around about 790 to 722 when Israel got taken away. Like Hosea, Jeremiah received numerous instructions regarding what to do and what not to do. And this divinely ordained lifestyle was itself a message for the nation. We see Jeremiah's self-denial as a message to the nation in verses 1 to 13 of chapter 16. Yeah, he gets a series of instructions here to deny himself some basic human rights, such as marriage. And this self-denial for Jeremiah was to send a prophetic message to Judah. So in verses 1 to 4, we see the first self-denial. And the first divinely ordained self-denial, we see Jeremiah was now forbidden to get married. Now, Jeremiah, as I said, parallels Hosea in many ways. Hosea was given opposite instructions. God told Hosea to marry a woman. She's a prostitute. He then told Hosea not to expect a happy married life. Hosea's very unhappy marriage would demonstrate a prophetic principles for Israel. Now, here we have Jeremiah. He was told not to marry. He was told to remain celibate. And his celibacy would serve as a prophetic declaration to the nation. And we see in verses 1 to 2, we have a word from the Lord. The word of Jehovah came also unto me, as Jeremiah, saying, you shall not take a wife, neither shall you have sons or daughters in this place. So he is not to take a wife or to have children, and the reasons are given to us in verses 3 to 4. For thus says Jehovah concerning the sons and concerning the daughters that are born in this place, and concerning their mothers that bear them, and concerning their fathers that begat them in this land. They shall die grievous deaths, they shall not be lamented, neither shall they be buried. They shall be as dung upon the face of the ground, and they shall be consumed by the sword and by famine, and their dead bodies shall be food for the birds of the heavens and for the beasts of the earth. Wow. The word of God was moving against the whole family structure. All segments of the family, sons, daughters, mothers, fathers, will all die grievous deaths by the sword, famine, or pestilence. They will not be lamented or buried. And in fact, their scattered bodies will lie all over the area. And because they're unburied, their bodies will then serve as food for birds and beasts. What a sight that would be. The second self-denial we find in verses 5 to 7. And the command comes in the first part of verse 5. For thus says Jehovah, enter not into the house of mourning, neither go to lament, neither bemoan them. So what God is telling Jeremiah is he says, listen, you do not mourn for them. Do not go into the house of mourning. He should abstain from participation in funerals. He should refrain from the lamenting and wailing for the dead. And the reasons are given in verse 5 to 7. God is now removing his protection from the people. The second part of verse 5. For I have taken away my peace from this people, says Jehovah, even loving kindness and tender mercies. So because God withdrew his shalom, his peace, his kesed, his loving kindness, and rakam, his mercy from Judah, the people would experience war. My gosh, when God lifts his hand away. Now, according to verse 6, both the great and small shall die in this land. They shall not be buried, neither shall men lament for them, nor cut themselves, nor make themselves bald for them. There's going to be so many dead bodies that the magnitude of the amount will not permit individual lamenting. Even though great and small will die in the land, they'll not be buried. And the lack of lamenting would manifest itself in two ways. First of all, no one would cut themselves. Now, remember, these guys were following their idols and their false gods. The Mosaic law specifically forbid this practice of cutting oneself. And we find it in Leviticus 19, verse 28, and Leviticus 21:5, and Deuteronomy 14:1. It was a common sign of mourning among the pagans, but for Jews, it was totally forbidden. Yet, according to Jeremiah 41:5, they continued this practice even after the fall of Jerusalem, once again breaking Mosaic law. So that's the first thing, no cutting of themselves. Second, no man make himself bald for the deceased. Now, the practice of shaving one's head was actually a common sign of mourning. And we'll see that in Jeremiah 41:4, Ezekiel 7:18, Amos 8:10, and Micah 1:16. Now, unlike the cutting of one's flesh, this practice of shaving your head was not forbidden by Mosaic law. And according to verse 7, common courtesies such as providing food for those who mourn would also cease. Neither shall men break bread for them in the morning, to comfort them for the dead. Neither shall men give them the cup of consolation to drink for their father or for their mother. The custom of providing food for someone in mourning is also mentioned in 2 Samuel 3, verse 35, 2 Samuel 3, 35, 2 Samuel 12, 16 to 17, 12, 16 to 17, and Hosea chapter 9, verse 4. Another custom was to bring a cup of consolation, and this practice too would also cease. According to the rabbis, the cup of consolation was a special cup of wine, and it was offered to mourners with a prayer of comfort. Third self-denial we find in verses 8 to 9. He was not to go to the house of feasting either. You shall not go into the house of feasting to sit with them, to eat and to drink. Now, the reason for restraining himself from joyful experiences we find in verse 9. For thus says Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, behold, I will cause to cease out of this place before your eyes and in your days the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride. So the reason in verse 9 is that God is going to, the reason he's not to take part in these joyful experiences is because God is going to cause an end to these things. The voice of mirth and gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the bride will cease in the land. No more joy. And he specifies a time by which he'll do these things. He says to Jeremiah, he says, before your eyes and in your days. So in Jeremiah's lifetime, these things are going to take place. So having instructed Jeremiah with these three self-denials in which he's to conduct his life in verses 10 to 13, he now makes the application to the nation. In 10 to 13, that is. So in the course of time, people are going to see Jeremiah's three self-denials, and they're going to raise some questions. It's, you're not to marry or have children, nor was he to experience the joys and sorrows of normal life. What's going on? These self-denials actually went against the Jewish culture of his day. So in verse 10, people began questioning Jeremiah's actions. It shall come to pass when you shall show this people all these words, and they shall say unto you, wherefore has Jehovah pronounced all this great evil against us? Or what is our iniquity? Or what is our sin that we have committed against Jehovah our God? So as Jeremiah explained, the people asked, why has the Lord pronounced all this great evil against us? What have we done wrong? What's our sin? What's our iniquity? This is the people of Judah asking these questions. These are the ones worshiping false gods. They'd become so dead to their sins that they asked why they were being judged and what evil had they done. They really had become blind. In verses 11 to 12, Jeremiah is to give them an answer when they ask these questions. Then you shall say to them, because your fathers have forsaken me, says Jehovah, and have walked after other gods, and have served them, and have worshipped them, and have forsaken me, and have not kept my law. And this is Mosaic law. So first up, the sins of the previous generation are mentioned in verse 11. Their fathers forsook God and practiced idolatry. And he's very emphatic about the practice of idolatry. He emphasizes the practice of idolatry in three ways. He says, first of all, the people followed after other gods. Second, they served these gods. And third, they had bowed down before them, worshiping them. They had owned these false gods as their God. And in so doing, they've forsaken their own God, Jehovah. And this was clearly shown in that they failed to keep the law of Moses. Second, the present generation would not only be punished for the guilt of their fathers, the people themselves had sinned. The guilt of their fathers was the idolatry that followed through. As verse 12 now shows us, the people also sinned. God says to them, you have done evil more than your fathers. For behold, you walk everyone after the stubbornness of his evil heart, so that you hearken not unto me. So as bad as the previous generation was, the present generation is even more evil. The present generation walks stubbornly after their evil hearts without ever listening to Jehovah. In other words, they carried the sins of their forefathers to an extreme. They were worse than them. And you remember that by this time, the Deuteronomy scroll had been found in Josiah's day, which is where Jeremiah is prophesying. He's around about that area. And everyone was aware of and understood God's law. Because they should have known better, they were acting worse than their fathers. Because remember that the law had been missing for a long time. It was lost. Now the judgment's going to come in verse 13. And this judgment has been portrayed by his three self-denials. They'll be exiled from the land. So verse 13, therefore will I cast you forth out of this land into the land that you have not known, neither you nor your fathers, and there shall you serve other gods day and night, for I'll show you no favor. So what he's saying is that the people are going to be taken into captivity, where they'd be forced to serve other gods on a daily and continuous basis. Again, this land is not named, but we know it's Babylon. As the book of Daniel shows, during the first part of the Babylonian captivity, the Jewish people worshipped the Babylonian gods. Only Daniel and his three friends refrained from this behavior. That's all. The fact that it is made an issue in the book of Daniel shows that it was a common practice for the Jews to practice idolatry. They chose to do so voluntarily. So therefore, Jehovah did not grant them favor or grace other than the four men, Daniel and his three friends. Now we're going to see in verses 14 to 15, we're going to see the description of judgment that will fall on the people of Judah. Sorry, in verses 14 to 15, we're going to see here the new Exodus. The new Exodus, this is going to be something different they're going to be talking about. The description of the judgment that would fall on the people of Judah is now interrupted by this, by a message of hope. The expression, therefore, behold, the days come. Remember, this is a formula for the prophetic future. He's talking about, he uses it 15 times in his book, actually. And this is the second of the 15 times that he uses it. Although looking around him, he sees nothing but devastation and death in the immediate future, but he is now given a vision of the distant future where things are going to be different. And verse 14 tells us something that will no longer be said. No longer will people say, as Jehovah lives, that brought up the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. Now, in the Hebrew scriptures, the Exodus is often referred to as the high point of Jewish history. However, in the future, there's going to be a greater high point of Jewish history yet to come. And in verse 15, the day is coming when the Jews will say, as Jehovah lives, that brought up the children of Israel from the land of the north and from all the countries where he had driven them. So he first mentions the north there, and then he mentions other countries. The expression, the land of the north, refers to the captivity in Babylon. And this captivity took place in 586 BCE, and before the Common Era, or before Christ. And the expression, all the countries whither he had driven them, refers then to the dispersion of AD 70. Since that year, since AD 70, the Jewish people have lived in the diaspora, in the dispersion. But in the future, there will be a worldwide regathering. And in second part of verse 15, he says, and I will bring them again into their land that I gave unto their fathers. So this worldwide regathering will result in the restoration to the land which the Lord gave to their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. So there's going to be a bright, distant future for the Jews, even if the immediate future looks very dark. However, before the final worldwide regathering can come in preparation for the Messianic kingdom or the millennial kingdom, Judgment must first precede the final restoration. There has to be judgment. In verses 16 to 18, we see it here. The judgment must first precede the final restoration. The restoration of Israel that was described just back then must be preceded by a judgment. The context and relevant cross-references show that verses 16 to 18 speak of the tribulation. It's a 7-year period of intense judgment that will precede the Messianic kingdom. In verse 16, behold, I will send for many fishers, saith Jehovah, and they shall fish them up. And afterward I will send for many hunters, and they shall hunt them from every mountain and from every hill and out of the clefts of the rocks. What is being described here is the hunt for the Jews, which will take place during the Great Tribulation. And the picture here is one of many fishermen who will fish for the Jews and many hunters who will hunt them in every possible hiding place. This is a very vivid description of the anti-Semitic campaign which is going to occur during the Great Tribulation. And the reason for it we find in verse 17. For mine eyes are upon all their ways. They are not hid from my face, neither is their iniquity concealed from my eyes. It is again the sins of the nations. God's eyes are upon the nation. He knows all their sins. They are not hidden from God's face. And their iniquity is not hidden from before God's eyes. Therefore, the nation, Israel, will be judged for her great sin. In verse 18, and first I will recompense their iniquity and their sin double, because they have polluted my land with the carcasses of their detestable things and have filled mine inheritance with their abominations. So all will suffer during the Great Tribulation, but Israel will suffer more. And the basic reason for this truth lies in her relationship with Jehovah. Because Israel is God's firstborn, we find it in Exodus chapter 4, verse 22, she receives double, both in blessings and curses. In Isaiah 40, verses 1 to 2, and first I will repay double for their iniquity and their sin. So this was in Isaiah. Isaiah laid down the principle that Israel receives double for all her sins. Again, this is based upon the principle that to whom much is given, much is required. Greater light brings greater responsibility. Failure with greater responsibility brings on greater punishment. So what we're going to see is that where there is suffering in general, the Jews will tend to suffer more so. And the tribulation will be uniquely the time of Jacob's trouble, as Jeremiah chapter 30, verses 4 to 7 will show. Jeremiah 30, verse 4 to 7. Now, we already hinted in verses 14 to 15, the Jews are going to be punished in two ways. On one side, there'll be destruction. On the other side, we're going to see captivity. There'll also be two types of exiles. We're going to have the captivity of the north in 586, that's into Babylon, and in the worldwide dispersion of AD 70. In verse 18, when he uses the term "and first," he's referring to the dispersion before the restoration of verses 14 to 15. So he says, and so first up, he says, I'm going to have to deal with their iniquity before the restoration. So there must be the issue of double punishment. They have defiled the land and polluted it with the carcasses of their detestable and abominable idols. All of this has reference to idolatrous worship. And they have filled mine inheritance with their abominations. Now, Israel is God's land and his inheritance. If you want to check that out, you can look Exodus 15, 17 and Joshua 22, verse 19, and Psalm 79, 1 tells us this. Now, I did say before that idolatry ended being a problem for the Jewish people once they returned from Babylon. It had so much of idols in Babylon that they're up to here with it. However, in the future, Zechariah 13, verses 2 to 6, Zechariah 13, 2 to 6, emphasizes the fact that during the tribulation, the Jews will once again fall back into idolatry. Now, what Jeremiah has said here in verses 14 to 18, he's going to expand it more fully in chapters 30 to 33. And in those 4 lengthy chapters, he's going to elaborate here. So we're going to get a lot more of this. Now, in verses 19 to 21, we see the conversion of the Gentiles. So here we go. We'll just read verse 19 first. O Jehovah, my strength and my stronghold, and my refuge in the day of affliction. Unto you shall the nations come from the ends of the earth, and shall say, our fathers have inherited naught but lies, even vanity and things wherein there's no profit. So, first part of verse 19, Jeremiah gives a powerful description of the God he worships. God is Jeremiah's strength, his stronghold, and his refuge in the day of affliction. And just as Jeremiah was promised back in chapter 1 and chapter 15, that God would preserve him through the agony of war, famine, siege, and captivity of the Babylonian destruction, so he will also preserve Israel through the tribulation. God's program, especially through the 70th week of Daniel and onward, will extend beyond Israel. In verses 19 to 20, he describes the coming of the Gentiles. The Gentiles shall come to you from the ends of the earth, and shall say, surely our fathers have inherited nothing but lies, even vanity and things wherein there's no profit. The phrase where he says vanity and things of naught, that refers to idols, idol worship. Now they ask the rhetorical question in verse 20. Shall a man make unto himself gods which yet are no gods? And the answer is no. They've done this in the past, but now they're not going to do that anymore. And verse 21 now prophesies the salvation of the Gentiles and shows that it will be a work of God. Therefore, behold, I will cause them to know, this is the Gentiles, this once will I cause them to know my hand and my might, and the result, and they shall know that my name is Jehovah. Now, other passages that show that this period will result in the salvation of myriads of Gentiles, we do see that in Isaiah 42 verse 1, Isaiah 42 1, also verses 5 to 6 of Isaiah 42, and Isaiah 49 verses 5 to 6. Isaiah 49, 5 to 6. Now we see Judah's indelible sin in verses 1 to 4. Judah's sin was deeply ingrained. In verse 1, the sin of Judah is written with a pen of iron and with the point of a diamond. It is graven upon the tablet of their heart and upon the horns of your altars. Now, the word for a pen of iron means a chisel. So this was a chisel that was used to cut into iron or stone. Also find it in Job 19 verse 24. It is also pictured here as having been written with the point of a diamond and written upon the tablet of their hearts. The first figure deals with the external element. The second figure deals with the internal element. Upon the tablet of your heart is internal, the altar external. Externally and internally, Judah's sin is indelible. It is graven upon the horns of the altar, and we see that their sin extended beyond their hearts, beyond what was inside, and now showed up on the horns of their idolatrous altars. The horns on their altars were stone projections at the top of each corner of the altar, and that was a place to be a place for sacrificing for returning sins, but actually the altar itself had now become sin because it was to false gods. In verse 2, specifically, their sin was idolatry. While their children remember their altars, their Asherim by the green trees upon the hills. Now, what's he talking about here? Well, what he's saying here is that the little children go around remembering and honoring their altars and the Asherim. He's referring here to the children who were so well trained in idolatry that they resorted to it with the slightest provocation. Let's go and worship the idols. What were the Asherim? Well, the Asherim were poles, wooden poles. Not only were these poles placed throughout the land, but they were also erected next to the altar in honor of Astarte, or it could be Ashtoreth. It depends who's writing it. And she's the queen of heaven. She is the queen of Astarte is the queen of heaven. Astarte was mentioned earlier in Jeremiah. Now, these poles were placed everywhere. They were located by green trees and high hills. They were traditional places of the worship of false gods. Ezekiel 6:13 tells us that. Verse 3 says, "O my mountain in the field, I will give your substance and all your treasures for a spoil in your high places because of sin throughout all your borders." So here we see in verse 3, my mountain, my field, refers to Jerusalem, the mountain of Jerusalem, Mount Zion. It will become a spoil, so Mount Zion will become a spoil. And the reason is that there is sin throughout the land. And then in verse 4, Jerusalem will also become disinherited. Jerusalem will discontinue from the heritage that God gave. And the heritage that God gave was the promised land, the land of Israel. God gave it to the people. But yet, Jerusalem will now discontinue from that heritage. And verse 4 goes on to say, "And you, even of yourself, shall discontinue from thy heritage that I gave you. And I'll cause you to serve your enemies in the land which you know not, for you have kindled a fire in mine anger, which shall burn forever." Now, the Hebrew word for discontinue was used for the sabbatical year. And you can find examples of that in Exodus 23, verse 11, Exodus 23, verse 11, Deuteronomy 15, 1-2, Deuteronomy 15, 1-2. Now, Jeremiah connects the word discontinue, which was connected with the sabbatical year, and the word disinherited from the land itself. Now, one of the reasons given for their captivity, Babylonian captivity, was that Israel failed to observe the sabbatical year and let the land lie fallow. Remember, every seventh year should have been a land of rest for the land. But problem is that during the time that Israel was in the land, 70 sabbatical years should have been observed, but they weren't. And on that basis, God now decides that the captivity in Babylon would last 70 years. The land would then catch up with the sabbatical years it was owed. So by being disinherited or discontinued from the land itself for the purpose of the sabbatical year, Jerusalem would have to serve enemies in a land she did not know. Again, the reference here is to the land of the north, Babylon. So the conclusion of the verse reminds Judah of the reason for this judgment. The nation had stoked the flames of God's wrath, which once ignited would burn forever. And again, it's just something quickly for you. Word forever is the word olam, and it's we see here it exemplifies a variety of meanings of olam. It's a Hebrew word for forever. In its range of meaning, olam can refer to an infinite period. It can also refer to the fullness of a life or a period. So, one of the things it says is Mosaic law is forever. Olam it just means it's for a life. It's for a period of time. It doesn't mean it goes into the eternity. But I'll just throw that in there for you. Okay. Contrast between the trust in man and trust in God is verses 5-8 of 17. Jeremiah now gives a contrast between trusting in man and trusting in God. Jerusalem failed to trust in God. In verses 5-6, he deals with the trusting in man aspect. The curse in verse 5 goes to the one who trusts in man. Thus says Jehovah, "Cursed is the man that trusts in man and makes flesh his arm and whose heart departs from Jehovah. Now, two different words are used here for man in this verse. In English, it just says man and man, but not so in Hebrew. The word used in this verse, the first one, where it says it is the man, emphasizes man in his strength. Man is seen as the strong one in contrast to the female. And the second word, Adam, is used in the sense of mankind. And this man in his frailty, this is man in his frailty, made from dust, who will return to the dust. So a little bit more literally, the verse would read, cursed is the man in his strength, who trusts in mankind, which is weak and will return to the dust. The reason for the curse in verse 5 is because the very act of trusting in man, one makes flesh his strength, which means he has departed from God. He's trusting in man, trusting in man's abilities. And the result of trusting in man is seen in verse 6, for he shall be like the heath in the desert, and shall not see when good comes, but shall inhabit the parched places in the wilderness, a salt land and not inhabited. So this is describing the person who trusts in humanity rather than God. It's describing him as being stunted. Why? Because he never becomes a full-grown tree. And such a person is going to be like a shrub or a dwarf juniper in the desert. And when good comes, it won't see it. Why? Because it's too short. He didn't grow up, didn't see it. It shall continue to inhabit parched places in the desert. This is the heath in the desert. This is the stunted tree. It will never really is capable of producing. He'll live in rocky and parched wastelands in the wilderness, a salt land not inhabited, and it fares when heat and drought come. So this is a vivid description of Jeremiah's own personal experience of chapter 15. In verses 7 to 8, he now contrasts that with someone who trusts in God rather than man. Unlike the earlier curse in verse 7, we now have a blessing promised in verse 8. Blessed is the man, in verse 7, we have a blessing. Blessed is the man who trusts in Jehovah and whose trust is Jehovah, and whose trust Jehovah is. We have a different figure used for him in verse 8. He shall be as a tree planted by the waters that spreads out its roots by the river and shall not fear when heat comes. But its leaf shall be green and shall not be careful in the year of drought, neither shall cease from yielding fruit. So previously we had this little dried, stunted juniper. Now we have this wonderful tree. The person who trusts in God will be like a tree that is firmly rooted and can reach the waters below, something a shrub cannot do. This tree spreads out its roots by the river. The Hebrew term here for spreads out, which is shalak, means to send. It means to send out. At times here, the connotation of stretching out, or even more strongly, thrusting out. These roots are being thrust out into the waters. This tree is actively stretching out its roots toward the stream. It doesn't have to fear in heat or in times of drought. It can reach down to the lower levels where the water is located. It will stay green and continue yielding fruit. And if you go to Psalm chapter 1, verse 3, Psalm 1, verse 3, you see a similar thing in Psalm 1:3. So this second figure is a description of Jeremiah's experience in chapter 16. Now, with that background, in verses 9 to 11, he gives a description of the heart of man. And these are pretty famous verses. In verse 9, Jeremiah emphasizes, let me just read verses 9 to 11. The heart is deceitful above all things. It is exceedingly corrupt. Who can know it? I, Jehovah, search the mind. I try the heart, even to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his doings. As the partridge that sits on eggs which she has not laid, so is he that gets riches, and not by right. In the midst of his days, they shall leave him, and at his end he shall be a fool. Okay. So in verse 9, Jeremiah emphasizes the depravity of the heart of man. It is deceitful above all things. It's exceedingly corrupt. Who can know it? Hebrew term for deceitful is the word akav, which means crooked. It means crooked, and it's used in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 4, for uneven or rough ground. The Hebrew term for corrupt, which is anash, means to be weak or to be sick. And in actual fact, the Hebrew text uses an expression from medical terms. It's used here in the sense of a grave and dangerous illness. Elsewhere in Jeremiah, back in chapter 15, verse 18, it was there, and we're going to see it later on in chapter 30, verse 12, where it describes a wound that is incurable. So in light of its exceeding deceitfulness and its incurable sickness, who can possibly know the heart of man? The answer is found in verse 10. I, Jehovah, search the mind. I try the heart, even to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his doings. God knows the heart of man. He searches the heart. Now, he tests or tries the mind. And Hebrew term for mind is kilia, which means kidney. And the word refers to the hidden depths of man and is set in parallel to the heart. So based on his knowledge, based on God's knowledge, he then rewards accordingly. So he will give to every man according to his ways. Now, verse 11 gives us a story of a partridge. Partridge is the bird. As the partridge that sits on eggs which she has not laid, so is he that gets riches, and not by right. In the midst of his days, they shall leave him, and at his end he shall be a fool. So the partridge sits on eggs which are not her own. And when these eggs hatch in the course of time, that little hatchlings will recognize that the partridge is not the rightful mother, and the partridge mother is then forsaken. So what happens to a partridge who sits on an egg which is not her own is what will happen to a rich man who gains riches, but not the right way, not by right. The riches will also leave him. And just as the chicks recognize that the partridge was not their mother and the mother was foolish, so the rich man who gains his wealth by unrighteous means will also be considered a fool. The mother was foolish in that she thought that the young chicks would think she was the mother. So the connection here in verse 11 to the previous verse is that when put to the test, the evil heart of the deceiver is revealed. Verses 12 to 13, he now turns to a bit of a brighter picture, which is the hope of Israel. Verse 12 says, a glorious throne set on high from the beginning is the place of our sanctuary. So verse 12 is an explanation concerning the glorious throne of God. It is set on high from the beginning of the sanctuary. Now, the sanctuary initially was the tabernacle. Then it became the temple. Now, what's so special? Well, that's where the Shekinah glory of God dwelled. The Holy of Holies was reckoned as God's throne. But now, the Holy of Holies, the throne of God, has been forsaken by Israel. And in essence, in verse 12, Jeremiah admits that his own statement in Jeremiah 15:18 was in error. Remember, he had accused Jehovah of being a deceptive stream whose waters had failed. But he was wrong. O Jehovah, verse 13, the hope of Israel, all that forsake you shall be put to shame. They that depart from me shall be written in the earth, because they have forsaken Jehovah, the fountain of living waters. So there's a danger in forsaking God. And in verse 13, the forsaking of the hope of Israel means to lose their own hope. Those who forsake God shall be written in the earth. What's that mean? Well, that's a figure for death. They're going to die. To forsake God is to forsake the fountain of living waters. It's to forsake the very source of salvation itself. In verses 14 to 18, we see the prayer of Jeremiah. And in this prayer, he's going to make 3 pleas. Jeremiah's first plea is in verse 14. Heal me, O Lord, and I shall be healed. Save me, and I shall be saved. Now, the reason he asks God to rescue him from any situation, for you are my praise. God has been Jeremiah's praise, and that's why he's asking to be healed, asking to be saved. Now, the reason he needs to make this prayer is in verse 15. Behold, they say unto me, where is the word of Jehovah? Let it come now. He is being attacked and accused of being a false prophet. And Jeremiah has spent years prophesying, but these prophecies had not yet come to pass. They hadn't been fulfilled. 40 years passed from the time of his first prophecy to the time of their fulfillment. And people attacked him and asked, where is the word of Jehovah? Let it come now. How come your prophecies have not yet been fulfilled? And they began to poke fun at Jeremiah and his prophetic office. As verse 16, as for me, I have not hastened from being a shepherd after you, neither have I desired the woeful day. You know that which came out of my lips was before your face. So here in 16, Jeremiah vindicates his ministry in 3 ways. First of all, I have not hastened from being a shepherd from you, which means Jeremiah hasn't refused to follow God's will. He did not refuse to be God's servant. He was called and he responded to the call. Second, neither have I desired the woeful day. The various prophecies of massive destruction, he has not prophesied vindictively. Jeremiah has not vindictively sought the destruction he has been describing. In fact, he was weeping about it. Third, he says, you know, that which came out of my lips was before your face. So what he's saying here is that all of Jeremiah's prophetic utterances came or are known to God because they originated from God. And because he was attacked as a false prophet and his prophecies were marked, Jeremiah now makes his first plea in verse 14. The second plea, Jeremiah asked, be not a terror unto me, you are my refuge in the day of evil. This is verse 17. So verse 14, first plea, verse 17, second plea. And this here is a plea for protection. The first plea had more to do with being vindicated in his prophetic office. The third plea is in verse 18, let them be put to shame that persecute me, but let not me be put to shame. Let them be dismayed, but let not me be dismayed. Bring upon them the day of evil and destroy them with double destruction. Yeah. In the following chapters, Jeremiah's main persecutors will be the false prophets, the other so-called prophets, they're false ones. Let the other false prophets be put to shame by the lack of fulfillment of their prophecies. Let them be the ones dismayed, not me. So rather than me being dismayed by the lack of fulfillment of my prophecies, let these false prophets be put to shame. Bring upon them the day of evil. Bring upon them the various prophecies and judgments God has already spelled out against them. Again, this is a plea here for Jeremiah's vindication. In verses 19 to 23, he gives an admonition for Sabbath observance and national survival. Jeremiah was instructed to give admonishment concerning the Sabbath in verse 19. Thus said Jehovah unto me, go and stand in the gate of the children of the people, whereby the kings of Judah come in, and by which they go out, and in all the gates of Jerusalem. So he was first told where to go with his proclamation. He's to stand in the gate of the children of the people. He was to stand in the very gate that was used by the kings of Judah coming in and out. Notice it says kings, the kings of Judah. It's plural, which means that it refers to successive kings. That's where he has to start, in the gates. He's to make his proclamation in all the gates of Jerusalem, which the common people used. Everyone, high and low, in all levels of society, must know God's message. And the message is given in verses 20 to 23. In verse 20, and say unto them, hear ye the word of Jehovah, you kings of Judah, and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem that enter in by these gates. He again mentions those who must hear this message and obey it. The kings of Judah, all the inhabitants of Jerusalem who enter through these gates must hear this message. And the message in verse 21, thus says Jehovah, take heed to yourselves and bear no burden on the Sabbath day, nor bring it in by the gates of Jerusalem. So do not bear burdens on the Sabbath. Do not carry these burdens through the gates of Jerusalem. The law was in effect during this period, Mosaic law. As long as the law is in effect, they must observe the Sabbath. In verse 22, neither carry forth a burden out of your houses on the Sabbath day, neither do you any work, but hallow ye the Sabbath day as I commanded your fathers. They must hallow the Sabbath, the day must be holy. Not only could the Jewish people not carry any loads on the Sabbath, but they were also allowed not to perform any laborious work. None of what was demanded of them in verses 21 and 22 was novel, because God had previously commanded these things to their forefathers back in Exodus 20, verses 8 to 11, and Deuteronomy 5, 12 to 15. That was when the law was being set out. In verse 23, but they hearkened not, neither inclined their ear, but made their necks stiff, that they might not hear and might not receive instruction. So the fathers disobeyed, they did not listen, they did not obey, they made their necks stiff. They made their necks stiff for the purpose that they might not hear. They wouldn't receive instruction. And the word discipline, the word means discipline, they would not receive discipline. Remember, one of the terms for the Jews is the stiff-necked people. In verses 24 to 26, he now tells the present generation that if they observe the Sabbath, there'll be blessings. It shall come to pass, if you diligently hearken unto me, says Jehovah, to bring in no burden through the gates of this city on the Sabbath day, but to hallow the Sabbath day, to do no work therein, then shall there enter in by the gates of this city kings and princes sitting upon the throne of David, riding in chariots and on horses, they and their princes, the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And this city shall remain forever. So if the instructions of 21 and 23 are kept and obeyed, which is keeping the Sabbath, certain blessings will follow. And this was also promised by Isaiah in Isaiah 56 verses 1 to 8 and 58 verse 13 to 14. The issue is going to come up again after the Babylonian captivity in Nehemiah 13, 15 to 20. Now, so it's an ongoing situation. Among the blessings in verses 25 to 26 are, first of all, the gates of Jerusalem will be continually used by rulers and common people. Second, there will be the continuous existence of the throne of David. And third, the city shall abide forever. The city will only be destroyed for disobedience. Fourth thing we see is in verse 26, the temple will become a center of worship. And they shall come from the cities of Judah and from the places round about Jerusalem and from the land of Benjamin and from the lowland and from the hill country and from the south. So what he's saying here is that Jews will make pilgrimages to the temple from all over the land. He begins to mention specific geographical segments of the land here. There's Judah and the areas round about Jerusalem. Benjamin is included, lowland of the Shephelah, the hill country of Judah and Ephraim and the Negev are also included. They're going to be bringing burnt offerings and sacrifices and meal offerings and frankincense and bringing sacrifices of thanksgiving onto the house of Jehovah. So they're going to be bringing the blood offerings of Leviticus 3, the grain offerings of Leviticus 2, and the special thanks offerings of Leviticus 7, 11 to 18. So Leviticus 3 and 7 cover these offerings. However, there will be curses for disobedience. The curses will ultimately work their way out. Disobedience to the admonition has already become apparent in verse 27. But if you will not hearken unto me to hallow the Sabbath day, then will I kindle a fire in the gates thereof, and it shall devour the palaces of Jerusalem, and it shall not be quenched. It shall not be quenched. If the instructions of verses 21 to 23 are disobeyed, then curses will follow in verse 27. The key aspect of the curse is the destruction of Jerusalem. And the picture of destruction is that a fire has been kindled in the gates of Jerusalem, which will not be quenched. And this figure, we've seen it, we see it here in chapter 17, verse 27. We're going to see it later on in chapter 21, verse 14, 49, verse 27, and 50, verse 32. So this unquenchable fire, 21, 14, 49, 27, 50, verse 32, and here in verse 27. So Jeremiah issues conditions by which judgment can be delayed, not averted. Judgment can only be delayed. At the same time, he presents these conditions to show that they will continue to disobey and to show why God is determined to punish Judah and why he must punish Judah. And that's where we leave it for this week. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.